There's a long simmering debate in Boston over the rules of admission to Boston's exam schools. There have been efforts to bridge the racial gap between the general public school population and students admitted, especially to the most prestigious school, Boston Latin. But so far, there has been little change in admissions, despite some new questions about inequality in preparation. To bring us up to date is a guest from one of the organizations advocating for change, Lawyers for Civil Rights. We'd like to welcome its Civil Rights Fellow, Lauren Sampson. Thank you very much for being with us, Lauren.
Thank you for having me.
Since the last time you appeared with us, we've had a new related issue come up, the federal case about fraud in trying to get into prestigious colleges. On one hand, maybe that has nothing to do with Boston exam schools where people might be playing by the rules, but what is the connection in your mind?
At Lawyers for Civil Rights, it highlights for us how much money plays a role in access to elite institutions. In the case of the admissions scandal, these elite colleges, it's you pay off a coach and they pretend that you row crew and then you can get into school. But in instances like the exam schools, it's you pay a very selective test prep instructor thousands of dollars and they help you get into a very prestigious school. So in both instances, it's access to money, which of course is not commonly shared among all racial groups in Boston. That means you have access to supposedly meritocratic institutions. Well,
we do have a test in Boston, but what about the test? I mean, was that test drawn up for kids in the Boston public schools? Was it drawn up for other kids? I mean, what about the legitimacy of the test?
So the test that's used is known as the ISEE, and the test that was created by the Educational Research Bureau specifically for admission to private schools in Canada and the United States. So it's in no way tailored to the curriculum at Boston public schools, and indeed specifically tests on material that isn't taught in most regular Boston public schools, for example, algebra. The test has also never been validated for students of color, which means that in sample sizes determining whether it actually predicts students' high school performance, none of the samples had the right numbers of students of color to really be predictive. And as I said, the material tested really reflects more accurately the content of curriculums at private or parochial schools, requiring students to take expensive test prep programs in order to really prepare for this one-day exam.
What about leveling the playing field for preparation? Because it's easy to believe that upper middle class families have a huge advantage, but there are even some families who are not that privileged or well off, and they have their kids cramming for 6 years. I mean, so what's the fair solution?
Because these exam schools represent so much of what's wonderful about Boston's educational opportunities, we believe they should be open to families of all races, of all socioeconomic classes, and of all geographies. Right now, the exam schools are completely unrepresentative of the demographics of the Boston public schools. The Boston public schools are over 80% children of color. That's completely untrue at the exam schools, in particular Boston Latin School. Our proposals are to maintain the academic rigor of the three exam schools while nonetheless ensuring that they are open to students of all, as I said, socioeconomic and racial backgrounds through, for example, implementing a top X% program where you could admit students who were in the top percentage of their middle school or of their geographic area. That way you don't worry about things like grade inflation, but you still ensure an academically excellent class. And that proposal, of course, would be race neutral. You admit students regardless of what race they are.
No, as it is, especially at Boston Latin, it's heavy on white and Asian students, underrepresenting Black and Latino students. If that were more in balance, what's the benefit to the world outside the school of getting it?
There's a couple different benefits from a couple different perspectives. One is the Supreme Court has recognized over and over again, as recently as 2016, the educational benefit of diversity, that schools have a compelling interest in maintaining a diverse student body, both to expose students themselves to a variety of different experiences and to enrich the classroom learning opportunity. It also ensures that students who are at that school who belong to a minority don't experience racial isolation. We remember the Black at BLS instances in which students of color at Boston Latin School specifically identified the way they felt targeted and marginalized, not just by students, but by other teachers. Ensuring that you have multiple students of color from multiple backgrounds at an institution means that those students don't feel isolated or targeted or like they have to stand as representatives of their whole race or socioeconomic class.
I took the exam to go to Boston Latin School many, many years ago. I don't think it made me any smarter that I crammed for it, but I've heard a lot of other people say since then, you got to have some kind of test. if only for mental stamina, if not for intelligence. What about that kind of equality?
I don't know that we necessarily think that a test has to be a component, as of course it's possible, like I said, to get educational excellence through other means, through, for example, looking at GPAs through a top X% model, given to the research that has shown that this kind of cramming and test taking isn't good for very young students, in particular students who might be 10, 11 years old when they're taking the test. I do think, though, if Boston is determined to use some kind of test, that it doesn't make sense to use one that isn't tailored to the curriculum that most of its students are learning.
You recently had a presentation on these recommendations in the community. What was the response like?
The response across the board was overwhelmingly one of, we need structural rather than incremental change. We heard from parents, we heard from educators, we heard from current and former students, all of whom agreed that there was some kind of problem here. And we had a really robust conversation about ways to fix it. The recommendations drawn from those meetings, as well as from longstanding guidance from the Department of Justice and Department of Education, really stem around a couple of initiatives. The race-neutral ones I discussed, like a top X% program, take the top students from the middle schools or from a geographic region, or something like a holistic admissions process similar to what universities use, where you admit an academically excellent class that's diverse across multiple dimensions.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Lauren Sampson from Lawyers for Civil Rights. Laura, I mean, when you have a holistic admission, it sounds like college all over again, and all those, coaches. I mean, isn't that possibly vulnerable to some kind of abuse too?
The possibility of abuse, I don't think, is a reason to not consider this kind of structural change we need, because we would argue the current system is rife with the kind of abuse that you're describing, right? The access to very expensive test prep programs, which means that students with particular wealth have access. Another example highlighted by news media in the past are the ways in which grade inflation, in particular parochial or private schools, means some students are just favored for admission over others. One example is Holy Name School in West Roxbury. In 2016, 69% of the students applying to Boston Latin School had A+ averages. Are we to believe that 69% of the students at Holy Name are deserving of those kinds of grades? We would argue this system, like any system.
Now, I have to tell you, I checked one of my old yearbooks from the 1960s. Holy Name was a big provider of kids to Latin because of their test scores. I mean, it's an upper middle class. We call it a lace curtain neighborhood in Boston. I mean, isn't that maybe the reason?
I think that, again, the discrepancy in the kind of grades, like to say that 69% of the students at one school are deserving of grades that put them at the absolute top of a class, the best of the best, that every student at Holy Name is the best of the best, is hard to believe, especially given that Boston Public Schools doesn't employ that same style of grading for themselves. They use a system whereby, in order to get the top grade in the class, a student has to show they're performing a full grade level ahead of their current year, which means that these Boston Public Schools, school students who are overwhelmingly Black and Latino just don't have the same opportunity to have access to a public exam school.
Laura, you mentioned New York because they have exam schools, some controversy there. They recently tried to do some things to level the playing field in terms of preparation. What about the results in that so far? The
results have not been overwhelming, to say the least. There was actually a report today from the Times noting that of the class that was just admitted to their prestigious exam schools, less than 10 are African American. And as a result, we have to ask ourselves, is what New York is proposing enough? New York is very focused on expanding access to a particular program that would help students prepare for the exam schools. What we're proposing is something far more structural, far more systematic, far more geared towards targeting the inequities that lie at the root of our educational system.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Lauren Sampson from Lawyers for Civil Rights.